truth is, you can't go on forever. That's why it's right that this is my last conference as leader. And of course, it's hard to let go, but it's also right to let go for the country and for you, the party.
Tony Blair Gaza peace deal controversy. Right. Before we dive into this absolute masterclass in political humiliation, hit that subscribe button. Go on. We've got stories like this dropping weekly, and you're going to want to be here when they do. There. Done? Brilliant. Let's crack on. Tony Blair has just experienced what can only be described as a very public, very international, and utterly comprehensive smackdown. And it comes courtesy of people who, frankly, have far more legitimate grievances than most. This isn't some minor snub at a parliamentary drinks reception. This is a former Prime Minister of Great Britain being essentially uninvited from what was supposed to be his moment of redemption. So let's unpick exactly how a man who once commanded this nation managed to get himself spectacularly frozen out by Hamas from Trump's grand Gaza peace initiative. Picture this. Donald Trump, fresh into his second presidency, is assembling what is calling a Board of Peace, this glorious international body that's supposed to oversee Gaza's reconstruction. It's supposed to be the serious, heavyweight option, the credible face of post-war governance, and who gets name-checked as a potential member. Tony Blair. Yes, that Tony Blair. The man who'd spent the last 2 decades rehabilitating himself through his Faith Foundation and his Elder Statesman Act. This was meant to be the pinnacle, the validation, the moment where history gives you a proper cuddle instead of throwing rocks at your head. Except that's not what happened. Not even close. Enter Dr. Bassem Naim, a senior Hamas official who essentially delivered what can only be described as a masterclass in political rejection. Speaking to Sky News, Naim didn't just say no. He didn't even say a polite no. He said it in a way that made absolutely clear that the entire region, Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims across the world, remembered exactly who Tony Blair was and what he'd done. And spoiler alert, they haven't forgotten. When it comes to Tony Blair, unfortunately, we Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims, and maybe others around the world have bad memories of him. Naim said. But here's the thing. This isn't some heated rhetoric or emotional outburst. This is stated fact, backed by the weight of actual history. He went on to invoke Afghanistan and Iraq. Both wars, both authorized under Blair's government, both now infamous for their catastrophic civilian casualties and their role in destabilizing entire regions. The words used are precise. Killing, causing thousands or millions of deaths to innocent civilians in Afghanistan and Iraq. We can still remember him very well after destroying Iraq and Afghanistan. Not destroying regimes, destroying countries. And is not wrong, is he? The 2003 Iraq invasion, Blair's signature foreign policy gamble, was fought on the promise that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction that threatened the West. It was the entire justification. The whole thing. And then in 2016, the Chilcot report landed like a bomb of its own, concluding that the WMD intelligence was, and let's be delicate here, completely flawed. Not nuanced. Not complicated. Just wrong. Made on the basis of deeply flawed intelligence assessments, the report said, which is a very polite way of saying the whole thing was built on sand. So here's Blair in 2025, presumably thinking he's earned his way back into the room through decades of careful work and religious charitable efforts. He's been rehabilitated in certain circles, respected by the establishment, a statesman, if you will, and then Trump's New World Order decides to build this international board to govern Gaza, and someone thinks, you know what? Let's get Tony involved. He knows the Middle East, sort of. Except, and this is a beautiful irony, the entire reason this board is even necessary is because of what happens when people like Tony Blair make decisions about the Middle East. But Naim wasn't done. He also flagged something rather significant about Hamas's position. When asked whether they'd disarm, he made crystal clear that no Palestinian group is simply handing over their weapons because there's still no guarantee of an independent Palestinian state capable of defending itself. So when you're trying to create a peace authority, and you've got one of the major parties saying, we're keeping our weapons until we have actual security guarantees, it's rather difficult to bring in the man who will destabilize the entire region in the first place. And it wasn't just name. Osama Hamdan, another senior Hamas official, piled on by telling Al Arabiya TV that all the factions, including the Palestinian Authority, would reject Blair. Not some factions, not a few objectors, all of them. The entire Palestinian political spectrum united on one thing. Tony Blair can't have a seat at this table. That's not just an awkward moment. That's a consensus. Now, you might expect the British political establishment to rally round one of their own, to defend the old guard, to suggest that perhaps people should move past ancient history and all that. And someone did sort of attempt it. Dame Emily Thornberry, chair of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, was asked about Blair's potential involvement, and she essentially said she couldn't be bothered either way. I'm completely relaxed about whoever it is. I don't really care, she said, which is British political speak for, I'm not defending this man, and frankly, neither should you. Then she did add that it would be nice if he had the trust of all parties if he was going to do something, which is a remarkable statement, because she was essentially saying that if no one trusts you, and they don't, then maybe you shouldn't be in the room. What makes this particularly delicious, from a political analyst perspective, is that this represents a fundamental failure of the rehabilitation narrative. Blair's entire project for the past 2 decades has been about restoring his image, proving that he was misunderstood, that his intentions were noble even if the execution was messy. The faith foundation, the elder statesman appearances, the careful media management, all of it was designed to create a version of Tony Blair that the world could eventually forgive and accept. And yet here he is, being told in no uncertain terms by the very people most affected by his policies that no amount of rebranding changes what he did. The Gaza situation is real suffering, immediate and ongoing. It's not abstract. And the people dealing with that suffering, who've already endured decades of conflict and American interventionism, are looking at Tony Blair being positioned as a potential authority figure over their future, and they are saying absolutely not. Because they remember Iraq. They remember Afghanistan. They remember the civilians. They remember the failures. And they are not interested in forgetting just because it might be convenient for British politics. This is what happens when your legacy in foreign policy is defined by catastrophic miscalculation dressed up in the language of noble intent. No amount of charitable work or diplomatic rehabilitation can shift that. The people who suffer the consequences have long memories, and they are not prepared to grant absolution on Trump's schedule or anybody else's. So Tony Blair, who once commanded this nation, who sent British troops to war on the basis of intelligence that turned out to be completely unfounded, who crafted his entire post-premiership around image restoration, has now been publicly and systematically rejected by every significant Palestinian and Arab voice. And that's not just a humiliation. That's a rather permanent verdict on what his legacy actually means to the people who lived through it. This is precisely the kind of story that reminds us why British politics, and global politics for that matter, is endlessly fascinating. Because no amount of power or positioning can fully escape the consequences of your decisions. History has a way of holding leaders accountable, even when their own establishment has moved on. And sometimes, that accountability comes from the most unlikely and powerful place of all, the people you've already hurt telling you that no, they won't let you do it again. If stories like this, the intersection of British political legacy, global consequences, and the absolute unraveling of establishment rehabilitation narratives fascinate you, then subscribe right now. We're breaking down UK politics with the seriousness it deserves, the sass it often demands, and the maturity to tell you what's actually happening beneath the spin. See you in the next one.